Okay, so moving on here, learning objective 8.5, how does IT audit, what does IT audit look like? How does it fit in here? So we're just combining those definitions we had before as far as IT audit providing reasonable assurance that the controls are designed appropriately and operate effectively to minimize operational and reporting errors or inefficiencies. Okay, so IT audit tries to get reasonable assurance around the IT function supporting the objectives of the firm. Okay, we have internal IT audits, so internal auditors can do an IT audit, and external auditors can come and do IT audits. And so the focus can be on any of those three objectives that are from the internal control framework, right? Operational, we have reporting in the middle, and compliance, right? And so we can have IT audits focused on any of those three areas. Obviously, we care more about the financial reporting piece, but just recognize the IT audit can apply to the other objectives as well. And so we're going to focus on those controls related to the IT environment. We can have business processes that are automated that we're going to focus on. Oftentimes we're not focused on kind of the glamorous external threat. Hacking is usually not the focus of an IT audit. There are special engagements that are focused on security, but most of the time IT audit is not designed to eliminate all the threats or evaluate all the external threats that are possible. We look at basic security, but we wouldn't go into as much detail as you would if you were doing specifically an engagement that's focused on those external threats. So we can have some different contexts. Think about the external IT audit. So you can have a couple different reasons why managers or possibly large shareholders could request an IT audit. The financial statement audit is going to need an IT audit piece, and so since a lot of the accounting information system collects, processes, and disseminates information through IT applications, then an IT audit or IT auditors will be required to be part of a financial statement audit. That's often what I did, or at least some of the time I was at one of the big four firms. And IT audits can also be required when working with federal agencies. So I think I did an IT audit related to the FFEIC, which is one of the regulators for overseeing banks. And so there are certain requirements from different agencies that might require an IT audit. How do you actually go about doing an IT audit? Obviously, we're reviewing kind of the documentation around policies and procedures for the different controls that are there. Then we'll go and review and make sure and test whether those controls are applied as they're documented, but that they're operating effectively, right, and consistently. Do we see any, for example, any situations where we have an application control of an approval over a certain amount? Do we see any transactions where there are situations where those controls are not applied, right? And oftentimes we will look at things like the ISACA has its Information Systems Assurance and Control Association. They have a framework that's called COBIT, and that's like the IT control equivalent to COSO's internal control framework. So it's meant to be kind of a focus on IT controls that's often used as the standard or the criteria to judge a firm's IT controls. So if you're talking about internal audit, then the firm wants to make sure its objectives are being met, right? And so there's a significant amount of IT or of risks around the IT function, and so IT auditors are trying to provide a way to evaluate how the IT risks are being managed, and are there any gaps either in the design of the IT controls or in the implementation of them, right? So we're doing similar things for an internal IT audit as you would for an external IT audit. And so those are largely going to be the same in terms of how you go about it. Now you might have a more narrow approach, like maybe you may have an IT audit engagement that's internal, that's only focused, for example, on one application, right? Like the procurement application. So you're going to have usually a smaller scope for the internal audits, but you're going to have a lot more of them throughout the year, right? It's typically how it's done. Now a firm could hire an outside group to come in and still perform an internal audit. It's called internal audit outsourcing. And so it's when an internal audit group within a firm doesn't have the resources to execute some of the engagements or the audits it wants to do, and so it'll hire someone else, like from a Big Four or a national CPA firm, for example, to come in and do an IT audit project for them, right? And so in that situation, even though it's an external party, it's still being run by the internal audit group, and all the information is still kept internally. If you're thinking about some responsibilities for IT auditors, obviously obtaining an understanding around what's important here for applications and the risks to those applications and controls that are present. Test those applications, make sure they're working effectively. You might have specific regulations or compliance requirements that you need to test. So for example, with the universities, for example, there's all kinds of requirements around grants and how grants are used. And so you might be testing controls that are specifically around disbursements related to grants, right? And so you're still doing testing. The scope and the subject matter just may be a little different depending on the actual engagement. Obviously, you're documenting results and presenting them to whoever's in charge, whether it's management or an audit committee or the board or possibly all three, right? And depending on the role, whether it's an internal or an external IT auditor, if it's internal, you can make some suggestions around how to improve the control environment. Obviously, if it's external, you have to be careful about the recommendations you give. Typically what tends to happen is you identify deficiencies, and the deficiency identified, to correct it is kind of an obvious extension, right? But you have to be careful you don't, as the IT auditor, become part of the process to create the controls you're going to then evaluate later, because that impacts independence, and we need independence. All right, so let's be specific then about how it fits into the audit, stages of the audit for our external audit piece. And so remember, planning the audit was step one. And so thinking about the IT system and planning, to what extent are we going to try to test the controls, the IT controls, what extent are we going to try and work around the IT controls and just test transactions only, right? We're considering that. If it's a new system, we would probably want to plan out more hours for obtaining understanding and testing than if it was a system that the client has had for a long time, and then that we've been able to get experience with in terms of how they have it configured. Obtaining an understanding, we're going to be looking at documentation of the IT system. So there's going to be narratives involved in all the processes that are used to enter transactions and process transactions. We can look at systems flowcharts, which just kind of show how transactions flow throughout the system from one department to another. Is it a centralized IT structure, or do we have, if it's a smaller firm, for example, are there local servers or local desktops that are being used to process transactions? The systems flowchart helps us to get a sense of that. A program flowchart might be used for a particular application. If you have like a complex accounting method, for example, that's being implemented by the system, then we might look to see how does the program process the input and how does it calculate what it needs to calculate and all those things. So a program flowchart could be used. Depending, you don't see those too often, but occasionally you might have a really important piece of an application you might want to get that kind of detail on. And then internal control questionnaires around how the system is configured and that kind of thing, passwords and user credentials, all those things that would be could be acquired through an internal control questionnaire. Step 3 or stage 3 of the audit, assess the risks. And so here we're just thinking about IT risks, and we're again thinking about the assertion level and really the audit objective level, which we're taking the assertion and the financial statement accounts together to create the audit objective. And so what can go wrong, especially when we're thinking about the IT risks. Consider whether those are significant risks based on the probability of the risk times the magnitude, and then thinking about how that could result in a material misstatement. And so we're going to be testing controls there, or assessing risks control risk related to the IT function. And so when we think about how to do some of those techniques, there's kind of some big categories. One is auditing around the computer, which is basically focusing on transactions, sampling those transactions, comparing the results to what the applications are generating for the output. You could manually test in terms of looking at control reports. You can also do observations and walkthroughs. And so when you're sitting down, if there's supposed to be an input control on entering a purchase order, right, related to a vendor number, can you put in some value that the computer or the application rather should reject and say it's not valid, and does the application actually do that, right? And then you can look at some of the reports that are generated as well to see, for example, are there attempts at unauthorized access to certain parts of the application by certain individuals, right? And you want to look to see who, for example, is trying to get access to certain things, and why might they be trying to do that. There's all kinds of ways to use technology to actually test IT controls, right? And so one is generating test data that could be used to test to see if controls are working. That may be a set of transactions that have different problems with it based on what the controls, based on the design of the application controls that the company says they have, and we can run test data through applications to see if the controls are doing what they're supposed to. An integrated test facility is essentially having a dedicated testing environment that mimics the production environment and allows auditors to go in and test for certain controls. That's a pretty costly thing to do. It can be done, but it's you have to make sure, for example, if the production environment is getting changes made to it, that those changes are also applied to this test facility, right? So it can be a nice way to test what the controls are in terms of their effectiveness, but it's not simple to set up. Some other things would be around kind of tracing transactions through the system to try and evaluate how the applications are processing those transactions. And the other way to do it is to generate your own kind of version of what the application is supposed to do. And so what you do is you'd ask the company to give you, for example, the raw transaction data before it's been processed. You create your own simulated program that's supposed to mimic what the application is supposed to do. Run that program and then see if you get similar results. So for example, you'd want to see the raw data, and then you could program in the input validation controls, for example, and then C, do those kick out any transactions, and then does that mirror what the output of the actual application in the firm. And so you're basically, it's called parallel processing, where you're kind of creating your own sequence of steps that are meant to mimic what the firm is doing in their applications, and then you take the same input and then see if you get the same output, right? So that's another way to test for application controls. All right, so then kind of the last thing here is just this plug for IT audit as a career. Obviously you need soft skills in public accounting in terms of project management, ability to work in groups, communication skills. Managing your time well is really important. So flexibility is also very important. Right, we're in an economy that changes pretty rapidly, and so you've got to be able to adapt as well. So those are things that you need that are soft skills. More technical skills you need, obviously related to business and knowledge of accounting, but then kind of understanding risk and controls, understanding technical knowledge around the IT functions in terms of specific operating systems and databases and applications, understanding IT infrastructure. And then applications, I mean, a lot of these applications that are listed here are really just kind of communication applications, right? How do you document information? But you also need to start learning about the different applications that are present within the firm and that are used. And so you start developing expertise around these different applications as an IT auditor, whether it's an SAP specialization or some of the other ERPs. Or yet you start developing skills around how to do some of this parallel testing, for example. And so we'll talk more about that as we get to the data analytics, because we can use analytics to do some of this IT control testing as well. And learning things like SQL, right, which is, some people say SQL, but it's a standard query language. So, for example, I worked on an engagement where a bunch of transactions somehow were lost, right? And it was just because the way in which they were updating the database created problems for data integrity. So those kind of skills are important.